Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel on investments in mobility. My name is Yaniv Aronovich, and I'm an M&A and tech partner at Tadmor Levy, Yigal Arnon, a law firm. This is EcoMotion's 10th anniversary, and I think we've been sponsoring the event for about 9 years now. And it's pretty amazing to see it grow from a little event at a kibbutz on bean bags to this, thousands of people, most of which are having lunch at the moment. So I'm really thankful for you for being here. With me today are panelists representing various types of investors. We'll hear from them soon. Michael Granoff is a managing partner at Manife Mobility, which is a VC fund focused on mobility. About 15 years ago, Michael turned down an offer to invest in Tesla. Correct?
That's correct, even more than 15.
And I think you accepted an offer to invest in Better Place, or almost accepted.
It's a pretty bad binary. One went to zero, one went to $1 trillion.
Yeah, so I hope you've gone better in investment since then. So that's Michael, our first panelist. Josh Berg over there, who decided to wear the same shirt as I did this morning, is managing director of Magna's corporate venture operation. Magna, for those of you who don't know, is a tier 1 company, probably somehow present in any car any of you drive today. Josh is an avid backpacker, and he told me that some of his best friends he met is Israeli best friends, right? Backpacking in Peru.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, are they here today, or
No,
okay.
Now they live in London, but they're from Rehovot, though.
Naomi Krieger-Karmi, sitting on my far left, is Senior Vice President at Social Finance Israel, which is an advisory focusing on promoting the impact economy. And she was previously head of societal challenges at the Israeli Innovation Authority. And previously, she was working for the Queen of England, which is just a better way to say she was working for the British government. And she still sometimes gets her spelling mixed up between British and American English. We'll forgive you for that. And finally, we have Zwika Bonstein, who heads Huawei's investments operations in Israel and Southern Europe. Zwika is an engineer by profession, and he's learned over the recent years that China is much more than, tea and rice, as in your childhood song. And we'll hear a little bit about that in a few minutes. So without further ado, let's get started with the panel. We don't have much time. Entering into what we all hope is the post-COVID era, maybe. We can maybe take a look back at how the mobility and automotive sector has evolved in the last 2 years and where it's going post-COVID. So I'd like to hear each one of yours take on that. Michael, you can start.
Well, obviously, COVID had an unbelievable impact on everybody's lives and on corporate life. I think you can divide the post-COVID period into those things that were transient and those things that will persist. And, things that devastated the auto industry, like the chip shortage, I think are transient. Also, there was an uptick for the first time in a long time in people buying cars because a lot of people didn't want to take mass transit. I think that's transient trend, but then there are longer term trends, and some cities experimented with closing streets, opening them up for pedestrians and bicyclists, and that's one that I think it will persist. And obviously the way we work and work from home and hybrid work and less formal, I think all those things will persist and will have a big impact on the future of mobility.
So I was going to ask you this afterwards, but we can do this now. If you were to take a look at Manife's portfolio and the way you decide which companies to invest in, say 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, and the way you do things now and your portfolio now, is there a big difference because of what happened in these past 2 years?
There is a big difference between the way we invested 5 years ago and the way we invest today. I don't know how much of it, part of it is driven, I think, by COVID. But for example, 5 years ago, we invested in a lot of companies that you'll see outside here today. A lot of companies based in Israel that are deep tech and selling into automotive. And we're very proud of the portfolio we built. Some of them now are public companies. Some of them are very highly valued companies. More recently, we've invested globally, including Israel, but we're actually across 8 countries. We're the first fund to invest in a company in the UAE. And most of those companies are more platform companies and closer to the consumer. And one that has really thrived in the COVID era is a company called Zumo. It's actually out of Sydney, Australia, operating in the US and Europe with specially optimized e-bikes for delivery couriers. And they lease these bikes to the couriers themselves or to DoorDash and Uber Eats and all the companies that then employ these couriers to do last mile delivery. So, that's an example of a company we actually invested in pre-COVID, but obviously had a big tailwind in that period.
Josh, what about you at Magna? How do you see the trends post-COVID?
It's interesting. I have this conversation, it seems like every day around, maybe a little bit less now, but for sure a few months ago, how's COVID going to change all of us? Are we going to not have offices? Is everything going to be delivered autonomously? And, et cetera, et cetera. My personal belief is that the humans have very short memories. You can already see us going back to all of the habits that we had pre-COVID. And in the past 2 years, there's been just a tremendous amount of investment in the concept of autonomous delivery, in micromobility, and all of these things that we thought COVID was going to push us towards. But unfortunately, although it accelerated our mind, it hasn't necessarily accelerated our behavior because of the chip shortage, because of supply chain constraints. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the next few years evolve, and if some of these things actually make it to market in a economically feasible way. Will we get our food and our medication and our coffee all delivered by autonomous bots on sidewalks and drones in the sky? I'm not convinced just yet. I think there are early adopters, there are fast followers, and then there's the automotive industry, and we're slow in every regard. But there's some good reason for that, right? Things have to be, they have to last 10 years, and they have to be with high quality, and they have to be at low cost.
Zwika working for a Chinese company. I know Chinese have taken a different approach on COVID, also going out of COVID, as we can see now. Has that in any way affected Huawei's investment portfolio?
Yeah, I don't want to comment about the Chinese policy for COVID. That would be too dangerous. But
they're just copying the Australian policy, but they did it 2 years ago and they're doing it now.
Trust me, you don't want me to talk about this, even though I do have an opinion. But regarding the COVID, actually, I think there are 2 parts to it: the COVID effect and the post-COVID effect. And as a matter of fact, in preparing for this scenario here, I did talk to a lot of people, and I would say, in general, the balance is equal. I think the legacy industry was very affected by the COVID, but I think even more important for me and for many of the people in the room, it opens a lot of opportunity. I see a big change. I would not focus so much on autonomous driving as much on the electrical driving. And I think that staying at home, people change their thought about mobility. And they say, I'm home, so I might as well have a car that I can, charge at home. Maybe it's a good time. And from what I can see, everybody who doesn't have an electric car is thinking when the lease is going to be over, so he can get one. And obviously, this is a huge deflection point in the market, which opens up opportunities for newcomers. And China is there. More than 50% of the electrical vehicles are done in China. And there is a big advantage in building an electrical car from the get-go, to start it from the beginning.
Me, Huawei is at least I know it as a telecom company.
Yeah.
Where do you come in?
That's why you invited me.
Electrification and maybe autonomous driving. What does Huawei do in mobility?
So I'm not sure how much was announced, but there's a lot of articles in the media, and basically what it says that Huawei is supplying the the infrastructure or supplying a tier one for the electrical cars. For example, it was published this month that Huawei with CATL and some major car manufacturers in China will have maybe a Huawei related or a car. So I think it would make sense to assume that Huawei will be providing all the ICUs, MCUs, infotainment, power, autonomous driving, the whole software, basically the whole infrastructure of the car.
Naomi, you here, your role is to do good. How?
Do good.
Okay.
Yeah, you can agree. How do you see, as someone in the field of ESG, how do you see us coming out of COVID, specifically in mobility? Has it impacted the impact investment world?
Yeah, I think it has actually. I mean, I think that one thing that COVID showed us is that innovation can be harnessed to help solve some of the big challenges that we face as a society, as humanity, whether it's on the health side of developing diagnostics and cures, but also on so many other aspects, where COVID forced us to find new ways to solve, issues of education, of social issues, of mobility. So I think, in a very big sense, COVID helped drive impact investing forward. I think even on a personal level, this was a time of crisis for a lot of people who came out of it saying, I want to dedicate my time to something with a little bit more meaning. And I think that we've seen that, both on entrepreneurs, on companies. And I think, if we look at where this meets mobility, so mobility is one of those industries that on one hand, it's easy to kind of put this blanket label of impact over all of it, right? We're helping climate change, we're reducing traffic, we're improving lives. Okay, impact. But I think that, there's a much more sophisticated understanding these days of what it actually means to be an impact company or an impact investor. And it's not just a badge that you can stick on something, it's more of a framework to analyze things. And there's a lot of variance there. I mean, there are investors who would define themselves only as what we'd call responsible investors. So just saying, I don't want to invest in something that does harm to society or to the environment. But there are more and more investors who are taking that many steps forward and defining themselves as impact investors, where they actually use two sets of criteria to evaluate investments, and they're looking for both. They're looking for that place where profit and purpose align. And I think COVID has definitely been a driving force for that.
So ESG has become a buzzword or a thing, in recent months, and even companies that don't suit the very sort of traditional impact investment per se profile need to be mindful of their ESG impact. How do you see that playing out? I mean, maybe we don't tell anyone, but the big car makers, the big OEMs, the tier ones perhaps, that were not in the past focused on ESG.
So ESG, if there's anyone who hasn't yet gotten up to speed on that, stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it's basically, three kind of categories of parameters that we believe today should be applied to all companies. So not only companies who define kind of their major product or service as trying to address an environmental or social issue, but basically any company. And we're seeing more and more interest and even pressure coming on one hand from investors and regulators, but on the other hand from consumers and even from employees who are looking to see companies that are, taking these considerations into account. And the idea is that, these are, on one hand, kind of from maybe an ethical perspective, a set of standards that we want each company to at least kind of evaluate. So what's my environmental impact? Do I have good governance policies? How do I treat my suppliers, et cetera? But it's also just good business, because, to say that I'm checking my environmental impact means I also have a more advanced thinking about, where's regulation going in the next 5 or 10 years and how do I anticipate that now? If I have a good policy, for internal governance, maybe that will help me, from becoming the next Enron. So it's really about, incorporating this into, from an ethical perspective, but also from a good business perspective. And the way the field is going in the future, is one, I think we'll see it becoming more and more standard that companies need to, at a minimum, report ESG. But some of the new thinking in the field, which is really interesting, like a project led by Harvard Business School with our chairman, Sir Ronald Cohen, is talking about impact weighting accounts. How actually, the entire accounting system may change to take some of these issues into consideration. Because if you're making a lot of money, but, dumping a lot of waste into the environment, that should be accounted for in some way, and it should be reflected in your financials in some way. And I think that's where we're headed.
So ESG is one trend. Another trend I'd like to talk about with Josh is moving away, I think, in recent years from the dream of autonomous driving to EV. Has that in any way affected Magna and its investment portfolio and what it's looking for?
I'm sure it has. I mean, look, we still invest in both hardware and software for autonomous vehicles. We certainly are invested and focused on advanced safety features in vehicles, and that's all kind of related. So I wouldn't say we're moving away from that, but we are aggressively moving forward towards an electric future. And we have to. I mean, our new CEO as of January of this year, Swami Kotagiri, he's very, very aggressively focused in that direction in a positive and innovative way. And I think we're looking at, it's not 10 years from now, but it's 50 years from now. What's our industry going to look like? And a company like Magna, we certainly don't want to be rendered obsolete. Everything is changing, and there's less components required for a vehicle. It's our job to get the cost down and to source parts properly, and so it's a big focus. It's a big focus for us, for sure.
A local trend we've seen, this one is to Michael, is investments, or I would say more interest between Israel and the UAE. And I know that Manife invested about 18 months ago in a company in the UAE called Phoenix. Can you tell us a bit about that experience, and do you see this trend continuing or being sustainable?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm proud to say that the founders of Phoenix are here today, both of them in Israel for the first time. And
are they actually here, or are they having lunch?
I don't know if they're in the room, but they're probably out networking as they're supposed to be. But if you find them, you should talk to them. They're terrific people. Yeah, we were very fortunate. They actually reached out to us very shortly after the announcement of the Abraham Accords, and we were able to meet them and actually to do a deal that closed just shortly after the White House signing ceremony. And I talk about the Abraham Accords a lot, and I do so because I think it's one of the most profound impacts in the region, obviously, well beyond just mobility. And I think it doesn't get enough attention, particularly in the West, and it's clear why, because it happened in the middle of COVID and it happened in the middle of Trump, frankly. But in spite of those things, I think the long-lasting impact of the Abraham Accords is going to be extremely profound in business, politics, and beyond. We go now pretty often. We've seen other startups there. I wouldn't be surprised if we do more investing there. This is a sentence that I can't get tired of saying because it would have sounded so bizarre a couple of years ago, but 2 weeks from now I'm speaking at a EV conference in Abu Dhabi. So I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of continued interaction between Israel and the Gulf countries, and we're very excited to be part of it.
That's very exciting and good to hear. I couldn't agree more. Zwika, will we be seeing more Huawei's of the world from China or other places looking into mobility?
Sure. Mobility is a lot. It's different. It's not only about engine and wheels. It's about software, connectivity, and we see a lot of players entering this market. U.S. and Chinese and dozens of Chinese companies entering. The entry level, the barrier is not so high to get into an electric cars. And I think I would like to translate it into a statement of opportunity because there's this huge deflection in the market. And I think there are many startup companies and entrepreneurs which may want to consider, realigning their business. It's my opinion that we enjoyed for many, many years being an extension of the US market. And we've done tremendously well on that. But with the mobility and the automotive and electric cars, there are new opportunities. And there are new ecosystems, new business models. And I think this is an opportunity that us, as a local society, should not miss.
So our final question will be more about the future. There's a lot going on. We talked about the post-COVID era. There's a war in Ukraine. There's a chip shortage. There's a supply problem, logistics. If there was one thing you say would impact investments in mobility and automotive sector in the next coming years, what would that one thing be, Naomi?
Well, I don't know if this is the one thing. Yeah, that's no pressure. But I do want to highlight kind of from where I'm sitting, looking at the impact investing world, where I think that some of the focus is going. I think there's been a lot of focus, initially on the kind of looking at these broad metrics that are relevant to a lot of companies. We talked about them: environmental impact, social impact, et cetera. But I think that if you look at what's really bothering the world, the consumers, investors today, it's the things that are really at the core of companies and how they behave. I mean, think Facebook, think NSO. Those are issues where, big tech companies, the biggest issue that they're facing today is really kind of, was anyone on guard looking at how the product was being used and the negative implications that could have and safeguarding against that. And I think if we ask where that meets mobility, it could be in a lot of ways. But, one example that comes to mind is if you look at Uber and Lyft, they've been facing massive backlash around, terrible things that have happened because they failed to safeguard the physical security of passengers. Writing that there have been, shocking numbers of rape incidents, of violent incidents, happening in shared transportation. The companies have tried to keep it quiet, but if you Google it, you'll find the reports on it. So that's one example, or protecting the data of your users, or avoiding AI bias in how you select drivers. So those are just some examples. I think each company is going to have to take a much closer look at, where their intentions were when they started and where things evolved to, and how do you create a way to manage those issues.
Josh, what would you say at Magna is the focal point of change in the next few years?
For me, maybe I take a bit different twist here. Many of you have probably heard, famous Silicon Valley quotes around software eating the world, and for sure software is. I think there's going to be a renaissance towards hardware, personally, and we have a very vested interest in that at Magna. I mean, we are one of the largest manufacturers in the world, and with the advancements in automation and robotics and in materials, there's a tremendous opportunity for humanity to start building things again in a responsible way and to advance in that way. And I think Magna is going to be at the forefront. And I know that my investment group is very focused on that.
Zwika?
So a few things. First, for Huawei, the future of mobility is very promising, as Huawei is newcomer into this market, and this is a fast-growing market with a big deflection. So that's one point. So for us, we see a big rise in our investments and our area of interest. If you talk about semiconductors, I just want to relate to that. The industry is shaping up for increasing production. We are very accustomed to this this sinusoid behavior of the semiconductor market. So probably in not too long a time, we will have sufficient supply. All you need is enough sand and some machinery. I mean, it's not so complicated. And as for how to address this issue, maybe
Well,
a country-
we have very limited time, so I'm just
Yeah.
going to get Michael give the final word on this.
Well, when my mom asked me about the truck driver shortage, I know that something has shifted in the public environment, and I think every technology, particularly around automated technology, needs a technology, it needs a market pull, and it needs a regulatory structure. And those last two things really haven't been there on, for example, robotic taxis. But I think they are there now on automated movement of things in many ways, including large trucks at level 4. And I think that's something we're going to see, and that's something that we've been investing around. And everything around logistics and movement of goods, I think there's an enormous amount of innovation that is happening and will have big impacts in the years ahead.
Great. Thank you very much, all. Naomi, Josh, Zwika, Mike. I hope you enjoyed the panel, and I hope to see you all here again next year. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Yannick.